Well, it's finally here. C# 10 has just been released along with .NET 6 and Visual Studio 2022. And so I thought I'd spend the next few videos just going through some of the features that are new in all three of those areas. And to start with, we're going to look at some new features in C# version 10. Now, there's nothing in there that's as big as, for example, the nullable reference types that we got in C# version 8, but there's a few relatively minor but quite nice features we can look at. And the first group that we're going to look at today are going to be the ones that simply relate to program structure and layout and that sort of thing. So if I just bring up Visual Studio 2022 and let's go for a new project and let's go for a console app, and we will call this C# 10 Demo 1 and then click Next and go obviously for .NET 6. And then it creates our Hello World console application just the same as it would have done before. And if we run that up, we'll see it behaves in exactly the way we'd expect, but you can see some quite substantial differences. The biggest difference you may notice is that we don't have a class called program inside which we have a method called main, inside which we have the console.writeline. Now, in fact, that's mostly exploiting a feature that's been around since C# 9, the ability to write in a console application this simple version that doesn't require all that boilerplate of the program class and the main method. They're still there actually underneath the covers, it's just we don't have to write them. The difference we've got now though is that when we created the project, it automatically gave us the console application in that format. So in Visual Studio 2019, although you could have written code like this, or most of this, it wouldn't have generated that for you. It would have still generated the full class and the method. So nothing absolutely new there, but just a change in the code generation. And you can see there, it's giving you a link to a website that explains what's going on there. But there is one specific change here that has come in with C# version 10, and that's if you look at this one line of code, so console.writeline, it's missing off what you might expect it needs, which is some kind of namespace, because it's not just console, it's system.console, which you can either access directly, or what you'd more normally have seen is we would somewhere here, and we can still do it because it's always backwards compatible, we could have just said using system. But you can see that's grayed out because it's redundant, and that's because we've got one of the first important new features we have in C# 10 for this sort of thing. Because if we go to the project itself, you can see it's got this thing called implicit usings. And that's set to enable. And what that does, it turns on this feature whereby for certain popular namespaces, they are automatically included as part of your project without you having to say using system, whatever it may be, anywhere. And in this case, the one that it's given us for free is simply that system namespace. It gives us some others as well. We'll see those in a moment. But that's why we don't need to actually say anything on that console. Now, let's just see what's been generated in terms of code there. So if I run up the intermediate language disassembler and then also open up File Explorer, and if we drill down, go into bin, go into debug, go into net6, and there we can see we've got the C# Demo 1 exe. If you're not familiar with that, this is something that changed slightly when Core was first introduced, that actually that exe doesn't contain any of our code. That exe is simply a bootstrap so that when you're running on Windows, it can load the DLL, which is where the actual code's contained. So when we do ILDSM, we don't want to look at the exe, we just want to look at the DLL. So we'll drag that in there. And then you can see there we do have a class program. So as I said, although we haven't mentioned it in the code, the program class does exist. And then also it has a main method, again, implicitly created, but that's what we've got there. And then inside the main method, if you look at that, we can see, if you understand that sort of thing, which I don't really, but that's the intermediate language for printing out the hello world. So it's all still there. It's just slightly changed in the way that this is all generated. Let's now start adding some code of our own, and let's add to this a class, and I'm just going to call this some class, and then it generates code for us. Now, something to notice here, which is a bit inconsistent, is that although when we generated the original project and got the program.cs, it used all of these new features, it's not doing that for the individual class, because look, it's got using system, which we know is redundant. So even if I put some function here, let's just put a constructor in here, I can obviously say console.writeLine and put in whatever I like, doesn't matter much. And that's system.console.writeLine. But even if I get rid of all these usings, including the system one, that still works okay because the system one was already included where I had my implicit usings enabled. So it's a little bit of the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, but obviously you can start changing your code to cut that out. But this also introduces us to another new feature in C# 10, which is the way we do namespace declarations. Because since time immemorial, if you wanted to put, in this case, some class into a namespace, you did it as we can see the code generator has done it here. It just says namespace, name of the namespace, then curly braces, and everything inside those is part of this namespace. But what we can now do, which is just a little bit tidier, but it makes less code, which is the idea of it, we can essentially do a file scoped namespace. So what we're now saying, by saying namespace and then just ending it with a semicolon, is this is the namespace that applies to the entire file. Now in theory, if you're using the curly braces on a namespace, you could have multiple namespaces inside the same file by closing one and opening the other. But I have never ever in my 20 years of using C# ever seen someone want to do that, because it's just going to mess up your code. If you've got that clear a break in terms of functionality that you can put things in different namespaces, then clearly they should be in separate files. So this, I think, is quite a nice way to go. It's a little bit like, actually, the change that was made in an early version of the language, whereby we didn't have to have using blocks anymore. So we used to have to say something like using var writer equals new, and then look how clever Visual Studio is these days. It's inferred. It's almost like it read my mind what I was going to put in there. So we've got that. And then we might say writer, again, write line, and whatever it may be. And so the using block closed with that curly brace, and that's when the dispose was called on writer. And then because that was, again, unnecessary, it was changed so you could also just have the using block terminating when the enclosing scope terminates. So similar sort of idea, rather than putting in these unnecessary curly braces, this using declaration now goes out of scope and calls the dispose on that curly brace, and this namespace declaration finishes when we leave the file. Let's just build that and take another look at the ILDSM. And another thing to notice about the way that that initial main, the program, was working is it is not inside any namespace whatsoever. So remember, we said it generates the fact we've got a class program and that we've got a method called main, but it doesn't generate a namespace called C# 10 demo 1, which is what it would normally do if you generated it with the older code generators. So that's something to watch out for, that your program is not inside any namespace at all. But your namespace for the class is working perfectly well, even though we've used this new syntax. So that's what we've got there. Now let's get back to the way that those usings work, and this idea we've had of the implicit usings. Because what this also makes use of is another C# 10 language feature, which is the global using. And what that means is I can, rather than having a using at the beginning of a particular file, I can declare it globally. So let's say I just wanted to use one of my favorites. Let's use the string builder. So let's say var builder equals new string builder. And we don't have the namespace for that. We can get it to be generated. So let's just use system.text. So we have using system.text at the top of the page. But as I say, that is only applicable to this particular page. If I were to take that same bit of code and put it in here, then it's not working, and we've got to put it at the top of that page as well. What we've got with this global idea is I could do this. I could simply here say global using system.text, and it's obviously still happy with string builder in there, but now I could go back to my other file and I can get rid of it there, and it's still happy with the string builder. So once you declare a global using directive, it's covering the entire of your project. And so that's really what's happening with the fact we don't need to have using system, because somewhere hidden away, and I'll show you in a bit, we've got this global using system. And so that's what we have. And then another slight variation on that, what I could put in here, I will have global using static, and then let's have system.math. So again, the idea of using static is something that's been around a long time, actually since C#6. It allows us to declare a static class as if it were a namespace. So math is a static class. But now we've got it globally, so I could declare it in there, and then in here, I could do something like var x equals, and then I could just say cos pi on 2. And so cos is actually system.math.cos and pi is system.math.pi, but because I've declared them globally over here, then it covers the entire of the program. Now, in terms of organization, obviously you can do it like that. You can put a global using in any file in your project and it applies to the whole project. But that's a bit messy. So what seems to be the way people are using this is you actually put in another class and simply call it global usings, and then delete all the code, and then just in there you put whatever you want to have. And so we'll just put in those two in there, and then if we just build that, we can see it's all perfectly happy. And now at least we've got some sensible sort of place where if you're confused about what's happening globally, you can go to that one place and see what's going on. Because I can envisage that this could start to cause some degree of legibility problems if we're looking at code like that and we suddenly can't see where the namespaces are coming from. But at least if we've got a central place that you'll have to, within your organization, decide exactly what you're going to call it, where you're going to put it, but you can make use of that. That said, there is another way that we can do all this without even having that file at all. So let me just comment that lot out. Because if we go back to our project file, when we did this implicit usings enable, we've said it gives us a using system and also a few other basic ones. And so if we actually, again, go back to the File Explorer and go up to obj and then debug and then net6, then you can see in here it's actually generated its own file called global usings, globalusings.g.cs. And if we open that up, then we can see it says it's auto-generated and it's got using global system and using system.io. And so that's why I was able, in the sum class, I was actually able to just use string writer straight off, because when you do implicit usings enable, it doesn't just give you using system. That, in fact, is the list of the ones that you get. Though, that said, that is the list of the ones that you get for a console application. So depending on the type of project template you go for, if you went for a web application, you'd get a different collection, and so on and so forth. So it makes a choice on that basis. And you can see, just from the highlighting in the code, it's only using a couple of them at the moment, but that's what we've got. And the thing we can do is we can also extend that list for ourselves purely through additions to the project file. So what I could do in here, let's put in an item group. And then in the item group, what I'll do is say using, and then let's remove one of the ones we don't want. So I could say remove, and then let's get rid of this one. So I'll just copy that, put that in there, and actually let's just leave these in for now so we don't get any errors. But if we now do a build, then we can see it's working. But more importantly, if we now look in here, we're not getting the system.net.http because we told it to remove it. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about that because there's no real overhead to these unless they're causing some horrible naming conflict, but that's unlikely to happen. So I wouldn't normally remove things like that, but you can do and absolutely tell what's going on in that. Because what you can also do, as you can imagine, is you can add them in there as well. So I could also do a using include, and then let's go for one of the ones we had in the global using. So let's pick up that system.text. Let's delete it from there and put that in there. And so now if we do a build, we can see we've got system.text in there. And then also, if we want to do the static one, we can have using and then include and system.math. And then also what we have to say there is simply static equals true. Default's false, so we don't need it on the others. Now, if we build that, it all works. If we look in there, you can see it's got a global using static. It puts in this global double colon just really as a safety measure. That's actually a feature that's been around for a long, long time, just in case you had some horrible name clash where somebody had written a class called system. And although it's unlikely anybody would be stupid enough to do that, that's why generated code tends to be very careful about this. Whereas when writing our own code, it's quite rare that you'll see that. But that's what's going on there. So that global colon isn't absolutely necessary, but in the generated code, they do it as a safety feature. So really that's it for those first few features I wanted to show you. We've got the fact that we have the new templates that in the case of a console application give you this very simplified form straight out the box. We've also got the changes in the CS_proj file. So we've got the implicit usings, which gives us that basic set depending on what type of application you've got. Also worth noting, we now have nullable enable. So nullable reference types are turned on by default when you create the project. They're not turned on by default in the language, so it won't affect any old projects you had, but rather than you having to go in there and turn that on, it's now there for you and you'd have to turn it off if you didn't want it. So that was just another little feature that we're getting straight out the box. And then also you can see we had this idea that we can have our usings and we can remove them or include static ones, and those declare our global usings, which are hidden away in this file and then accessible throughout the whole project. The degree to which I'll use any of these features, I'm not entirely sure. In terms of things like having the namespace without the curly braces, well, to be honest, I write that for myself so rarely because normally you just do what I did, which was do add class or something like that. And if the add class code generator isn't doing that, I'm not going to bother to rewrite it. I imagine in a later version of Visual Studio, it'll just do that automatically. But it's quite a nice feature. I'd certainly embrace it if I want to. The features we've got with those global usings, again, I'm not entirely sure. If it's generating the code for me, I probably will do it because normally the way I write code is I write the class, I notice I don't have the namespace, and then I include the using. So if it's already there, I'm not going to notice it that much. The actual new format of the program for a console application, this one I think is going to irritate me quite a bit because the main situation I use console applications is to quickly throw together a demo to demonstrate some feature of the language. And although basic features I could obviously type straight in here, the sort of the second thing I normally do is I want to add a second static method to the program class that I can call from the main method. And there's no way to do that here. The only way you could add a second method to program, you'd have to rewrite it the old way and actually make it a class, therefore you can add methods. So I'm not so sure I'll be happy about this, but it's very early days yet. I've really deliberately almost avoided looking at the previews for this version because I've been busy with other stuff, and it's always worth waiting until it's out and see what's really happening. But how these sorts of things will be adopted, we'll see over the coming months. So I hope you enjoyed that. Our first look at C#10. There's a number of other features to look at, particularly in the area of records. That's probably the most interesting one we'll look at in a later video. But if you did like that, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.